It's been 50 years, though, after his disappearance, and now a missing teenager is finally identified, and there is a connection to all this in Southern Oregon. Mark Smith disappeared after leaving his home in Montana back in 1974. Skeletal remains were discovered. That was in 1978 in Joseph.
In November 1978, a 16-year-old girl was found strangled beneath the pine trees bordering Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington, and the man who killed her was already dead before investigators even had a name to chase. He had been dead for 3 years. He died in a fire in 1981, and for 42 more years after that, nobody knew he was the one. It would take until 2023, 45 years after a teenager never came home, for a strand of DNA and a family tree built by strangers on the internet to finally give Krisann Baxter what the system owed her from the beginning. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. People from all over the world follow these cases, and it matters to know you're out here. The late 1970s carried a specific kind of American unease. Disco was in its last years. The Vietnam War had been over for 3 years, but the country hadn't quite figured out what it was supposed to feel like afterward. In Spokane, Washington, a mid-sized city in the eastern part of the state, life moved at the pace of a college town wrapped inside a working-class city. Whitworth University sat on the north side of town, its campus ringed by the tall ponderosa pines that define that part of the Pacific Northwest. Quiet, dense, the kind of forest that feels peaceful until it doesn't. Krisann Baxter was 16 years old. She was a sophomore navigating the ordinary pressures of being a teenager in a mid-sized American city. School, friends, the particular hopefulness of someone who still believed the world was mostly safe. People who knew her described a girl who laughed easily and moved through life with the kind of energy that makes adults remember certain teenagers long after they've grown up. She had plans. She had a future that extended far beyond November 1978. That is the only way to begin a story like this, by making clear that what was taken was not just a life, but everything that life was supposed to become. On the evening of November 12, 1978, Krisann left home. The exact sequence of her movements that night has never been reconstructed with complete certainty, and investigators would spend years trying to fill in those hours. What is known is that she ended up near the Whitworth University campus, an area she would have been familiar with in a neighborhood that in 1978 felt accessible and unremarkable, the kind of place a teenager might walk through without a second thought. At some point that evening, she encountered Keith D. Lindblom. What happened in the time between that encounter and what investigators found the next morning is documented only by the physical evidence collected at the scene and during her autopsy. She was found beneath the pines near the university campus. She had been strangled. She was 16 years old. The moment investigators found her, the case entered a category that defined too many crimes of that era. Physically present evidence, forensic material collected, and almost no ability to do anything useful with it. The medical examiner documented everything. Biological evidence was collected during the autopsy with the care and precision that the 1978 state of the science allowed. Swabs were taken, samples were preserved, and then they went into storage because in 1978, DNA profiling did not exist. The structure of DNA had been understood for decades, but the forensic application, the ability to take a biological sample from a crime scene and match it to a specific human being, was still years away. The evidence that would eventually name Krisann's killer was sitting in a storage facility while investigators worked the case with what they actually had. Interviews, physical descriptions, the geography of the crime scene, and the grinding patience of detectives working a case that kept going cold. The investigation moved the way homicide investigations moved in 1978. Detectives canvassed the area around Whitworth. They interviewed people who knew Krisann, people who had been in the area that night, anyone who might have seen something. They built a list of persons of interest and worked through it. They followed leads that dissolved. They identified questions they couldn't answer. In the language of case files, the investigation remained open, But in practical terms, the trail went cold within the first year. There were no witnesses who could place a specific individual with Krisann at the time of her death. There was no confession. There was no one name that the evidence pointed to with enough certainty to build a case. Krisann's killer walked away, and the system, not through malice but through the simple, devastating limitation of what 1978 forensic science could accomplish, let him. That limitation is important to name directly, because it explains everything that came after. In the late 1970s, a biological sample at a crime scene could tell investigators general things, blood type, some basic biological markers, but it could not tell them who. The leap from a sample to a name required DNA typing, and that technology wouldn't exist in a usable forensic form until the late 1980s. By the time forensic DNA analysis became standard practice, many cold cases from the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s had files that were already a decade or more old. Evidence had sometimes been lost, degraded, or improperly stored. Cases that should have been solved with the new science were already at a disadvantage because the evidence had aged through years of institutional neglect. Krisann's case was one of the fortunate ones. The biological evidence collected in 1978 had survived. That was not guaranteed. That was not the norm. That was the result of someone, somewhere in the evidence storage chain, doing their job correctly for 45 years without knowing why it mattered. In the 1990s, as DNA technology became standard, investigators returned to Krisann's case. The evidence was tested. A DNA profile was developed from the biological material collected during her 1978 autopsy. That profile, a precise genetic signature belonging to her killer, was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, which by then contained millions of profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across the country. Investigators waited for a hit. The system searched. No match came back. The profile sat in the database, accurate and complete, belonging to a man whose DNA had never been collected by law enforcement, whose name was not in any criminal justice database. In 1978, Keith Lindblom had not been arrested. He had not been convicted of anything. He existed in no system that would have flagged him. And by the time his DNA profile was sitting in CODIS waiting for a match, Lindblom himself had been dead for more than a decade. He died in 1981. A fire. The details of his death were unremarkable in the way that deaths are when they happen to people who are not yet suspects. Noted, recorded, and filed away without any connection to an open homicide case in Spokane. To everyone who knew about the Baxter case, Lindblom was nobody. He was not a person of interest. He was not in the file. He was a name that didn't exist in that investigation in any form. He had killed a 16-year-old girl, and then 3 years later he had died, and the world had simply moved on, carrying Krisann's case into the decades with no answer attached to it. The family did not move on. This is the part of cold case history that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The years and decades of family living with an open wound that the justice system couldn't close. Krisann's case stayed alive because people kept it alive. Her family carried it. Detectives who cycled through the Spokane County Sheriff's Office over the years encountered the file and made the choice to keep working it, to keep the evidence properly maintained, to treat a 1978 murder as something that still deserved resolution even when the trail had been cold for longer than many of those detectives had been alive. Cold cases survive through institutional stubbornness and human grief in roughly equal measure, and the Baxter case had both. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office submitted the DNA profile to various investigative programs over the years. The profile was reanalyzed as technology improved. Every time a new forensic tool became available, investigators brought it back to Krisann's case. This is what good detective work on a cold case looks like. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but years of incremental effort, updating the file, resubmitting the evidence, refusing to declare the case unworkable. The CODIS database grew and the profile still didn't match. But a different kind of revolution was coming, and it would not come through law enforcement databases at all. Genetic genealogy is the technique that changed cold case investigation more dramatically than any development since DNA typing itself. Here is how it works in plain terms. Consumer DNA testing companies, services like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and GeneMatch have collected genetic profiles from millions of ordinary people who pay to learn about their ancestry and family health history. Those databases contain partial genetic information that can be compared against an unknown DNA profile to find relatives. Not the person themselves, but people who share enough DNA to indicate a family relationship. Second cousins, third cousins, people who share a great-grandparent with the unknown subject. An investigator with an unidentified DNA profile can upload it to one of these databases with legal authorization and search for partial matches. If they find distant relatives, they can use traditional genealogical research methods to build family trees upward and outward from those matches, working through census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, and obituaries to map out entire family networks. Eventually, they narrow the field. They identify candidates who fit the geographic profile, the age range, the biological sex. They obtain a reference DNA sample from a living relative, from a discarded item, from a burial site, and they confirm the match. This is not science fiction. This is the technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. It is the technique that has since been applied to hundreds of cold cases across the United States and beyond. It requires expertise, patience, and access to the genealogical databases, but it requires no cooperation from the suspect and no existing criminal record. It can reach back to people who died before modern forensic science existed. It can find the family connections of a man who died in a fire in 1981. In 2023, investigators working the Baxter case submitted the DNA profile from Krisann's autopsy evidence to a genetic genealogy analysis. The specific methodology, whether through Parabon Nanolabs, a law enforcement partnership with a genealogy database, or an in-house investigative genealogist, produced partial DNA matches in a consumer database. Those matches pointed to family lines that investigators could trace. Genealogists began building trees, following the branches backward and forward through generations, looking for a male ancestor or descendant who fit the profile. Someone who had been in the Spokane area in November 1978, who was the right age, who matched the biological characteristics indicated by the DNA. The tree grew. Branches were eliminated. One name kept appearing at the intersection of the geographic evidence and the family structure. Keith D. Lindblom. Investigators pulled everything they could find on Lindblom. He had been in Spokane in 1978. He was the right age. He fit the profile. And in 1981, he had died in a fire, which explained with terrible clarity why his DNA had never appeared in Cody's. He had never been arrested for anything that would have resulted in a DNA sample being taken. He had gone to his grave unknown to law enforcement as a suspect in any crime. Confirming the identification required obtaining a DNA sample that could be compared to the crime scene profile. Investigators located surviving biological relatives of Lindblom and obtained reference samples through voluntary cooperation or court order. The specific mechanism has not been publicly detailed. The comparison was run. The results came back. The DNA from the biological evidence collected at Krisann Baxter's autopsy in 1978 matched the genetic profile of Keith D. Lindblom. 45 years after a 16-year-old girl was found strangled beneath the pines near Whitworth University, investigators had a name. The case was solved, and the man who killed her had been beyond any court's reach for 42 of those years. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. Keith D. Lindblom died in 1981, and the criminal justice system has no mechanism for prosecuting the dead. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office announced the identification publicly, naming Lindblom as the person responsible for Krisann Baxter's death. The case was officially closed. For the family, the announcement carried the particular weight of an answer that arrives too late for any of the forms of justice the legal system was designed to provide. No courtroom, no sentencing, no moment where they could look at the man responsible and hear a verdict read aloud. What they received instead was a name, a confirmation, and the knowledge that the case had not been forgotten. Spokane County Sheriff's investigators held a press conference and named Lindblom publicly. A spokesperson for the sheriff's office stated that while it was not the outcome anyone would have chosen, the identification of Krisann's killer brought resolution to a case that had weighed on the department for generations of investigators. Krisann's family, in a statement released through investigators, said that knowing the truth, even this late, even with no trial to follow, gave them something they had spent 45 years without. They used the word peace. That word, under these circumstances, carries an enormous amount of weight. 3 lessons come directly from this case, and each one is worth carrying forward. First, evidence preservation is not a passive act. It is an ongoing decision that must be actively made. The biological evidence from Krisann Baxter's 1978 autopsy survived for 45 years because someone in the evidence chain treated it as worth keeping. Evidence from that era is routinely lost, destroyed, or degraded beyond use through neglect, budget cuts, storage failures, or the simple institutional assumption that a cold case will never be solved. If you have a family member whose case went cold in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, contact the investigating agency directly and ask specifically whether biological evidence was collected, whether it still exists, and whether it has been submitted for DNA analysis. Do not assume. Do not accept vague reassurances. Get a specific answer in writing. Evidence that no one checks on is evidence that disappears. Second, genetic genealogy operates on a principle that most people have not fully absorbed. Your DNA is not only your information. When you or any blood relative submits a DNA sample to a consumer testing service, you're contributing partial genetic information about your entire biological family, including people who never consented to any database, including people who are deceased. This is not an argument against consumer DNA testing. It is a fact about how the technology works. Keith Lindblom's family members likely submitted their DNA to learn about ancestry or health risks. They had no idea what their profiles would eventually help investigators find. This is the architecture that makes genetic genealogy possible, and it is one that society is still working out the ethics of in real time. Third, the resolution of a cold case does not require conviction to be meaningful. For decades, the dominant assumption in American criminal justice culture has been that justice means prosecution, trial, and sentencing, and that without those steps, closure is impossible. Krisann Baxter's case challenges that assumption directly. The identification of her killer, made public by the agency that investigated her death, named the responsible person for the historical record. It ended the question. It is not the same as a trial. It is not the same as accountability in the legal sense. But it is not nothing. For families navigating cases where the suspect has died, disappeared, or where prosecution is otherwise unavailable, the public identification of a responsible party, through proper investigative channels and confirmed DNA evidence, can be a form of resolution that the system is only beginning to recognize as legitimate. Advocate for it. Demand it. It is within the system's power to provide, and too many agencies still treat public identification of deceased suspects as optional. Krisann Baxter was 16 years old in November 1978. She deserved better from the world she lived in and from the decade she was born into. She got the answer eventually. Not because the system worked perfectly, but because evidence survived, because investigators kept working, and because the technology that didn't exist when she died was finally turned toward finding her killer. 45 years is too long. It is also not the end of her story. It is the part where her name gets spoken again, out loud, in full, until nobody forgets it. If this case stayed with you, and I think it did, share it. Tag someone who follows true crime history. And in the comments, tell me, do you think public identification of a deceased suspect with no trial possible counts as justice? I want to know where you stand on that. The conversation matters.